Hello everyone and welcome to my lecture about Materia, Medica and ethnobotany in the pre-modern world. My name is Wouter Klein. I have been a PhD student at Utrecht University where I finished a dissertation about the history of medicinal plants, especially exotic medicinal plants in the early modern period, so roughly between 1650 and 1800. Today I will tell you about the history of Materia Medica, medical substances generally throughout world history. I will frequently use the words pre-modern and early modern. Pre-modern to indicate everything before 1800 and early modern for everything roughly between 1500 and 1800. Of course, 1800 is a big turning point in world history in general because of the French and industrial revolutions, but it is also a big turning point in history of science and pharmacy more specifically, as I will point out later in this talk. In this talk, I will address a few topics. First of all, the importance of the classical tradition in the history of medicine, pharmacy, and botany. The lasting importance of classical authors, that is. I will say something about early modern innovations, especially plant illustrations that become important from the 16th century onwards. And I will say something about the importance of medicinal plants in pharmaceutical practice, especially exotic plants. And I will finish with some examples of Dutch bioprospecting, which is in a way another word for ethnobotany in the early modern period. Let's start with the classical tradition. The first thing I would like to emphasize is the importance of classical authors in early modern botany, medicine, and pharmacy. And I want to illustrate that with this example of a book by Carolus Clusius. Carolus Clusius is one of the famous Dutch, Flemish authors on botany from the 16th century. He translated and wrote many important works about European and non-European flora, one of which is this book. You see the title image here from 1601, the Rariorum Plantarum Historia, the history of strange plants. And I want to show you this image because what you see here are some of the most famous classical writers. On the bottom left you see Theophrastus. He was a student of Aristotle who wrote an important work on botany, and on the right you can see, the bottom right you can see Dioscorides, who was a military physician in the army of Emperor Nero, so that's the 1st century AD. And you see these important botanical authors on the frontispiece of a 16th century work on unknown plants. That is, plants that were not known to either Theophrastus or Dioscorides. So this is new knowledge. But the first thing you do in the 16th century when you encounter a new plant is to compare it with plants that you already know. In other words, you will first look up what can be found about similar plants in works of the likes of Theophrastus or Dioscorides or Pliny or any other famous botanical author, and that's what Clusius and other botanists did. So in that sense, it's no coincidence that you encounter classical authors on the title page of a book on non-European, non-Mediterranean plants such as this. I want to illustrate this with an example. What you see here is the colocynth apple, a Mediterranean plant that was also used in medicine in the early modern period. And on the left you can see the start of the entry on colocynth apple in Nicolas Lemery's Dictionary on Medicinal Substances in Dutch translation. Lemery was a French physician from the late 17th century, and what he does here is very familiar for many handbooks on botany in the early modern period. He starts with listing all the names that were used for colocynth apple by previous authors. And in this list you can see all the famous authors from the 16th and 17th century, the likes of Rembert Dodoens from the Netherlands, Gerard and Parkinson, who are both famous British physicians, the Swiss physician Jean Bohin and his brother Caspar Bohin, German botanists like Konrad Gessner and Valerius Cordus, Italian like Andrea Cesalpino. So all important authors are represented here. So how would these medicinal substances be used in medical practice? According to early modern medical theory, there were 4 humors present in every human body: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And your medical constitution would be made up of the balance between these 4 humors. This balance would also determine when you were ill. And to cure a disease was a very personal matter. Every disease had to be cured with a counteracting remedy, or as they said in Latin, contraria contrariis curentur. Every disease and every remedy would have certain qualities. They could be defined as either hot or cold, and they could be defined as either moist or dry. And every disease had to be cured with an opposite remedy. So a hot disease like fever, as you can imagine, would have to be cured with a cold disease. But your medical situation would be determined by many other factors as well, not only the humors, but also the elements, the situation of the planets, the hour of the day, the season of the year, the region you lived in, and your stage of life. So every cure for a disease had to be very specific to your personal constitution. There was another medical framework that was actually the exact opposite of humoral theory. Whereas humoral theory emphasized the importance of the opposite quality between remedy and disease, the doctrine of signatures emphasized the importance of similarity between disease and remedy. This had a theological background. It was believed that God had created medicinal plants on the exact same place as where the diseases would rage that could be cured with these plants. The doctrine of signature has left many botanical names in common speech today. I have shown some examples of substances, botanical substances that were used or thought to work against specific diseases. For instance, the walnut was thought to cure diseases of the brain, as the walnut looks a bit similar to a human brain. St. John's wort was thought to be useful against conditions of the skin, as the texture of the leaves resembles the human. Lungwort was used against conditions of the lungs, obviously, because the shape of leaves of lungwort resemble human lungs. And spleenwort was used against conditions of the spleen, as the image on the leaves of spleenwort resemble the human spleen. Of course, the doctrine of signatures is entirely wrong from a medical point of view, but nevertheless, many herbs are still used today because of their supposed therapeutic action based on the similar properties between disease and remedy. An example is shown here. This is a warning from LAREP, the Dutch Center for the Study of Side Effects of Remedies, which warns against the use of St. John's wort against psychological conditions because it can bring about many dangerous side effects when used in combination with antidepressants. Nevertheless, the doctrine of signatures was taken very seriously in the early modern periods. Here I show you an example from a famous work by Italian physician Giambattista della Porta, who provided images to point out the similarity between certain medicinal herbs and the medical conditions they could be used against. The second plant from the left is Sarsaparilla, which was supposedly useful against snake bites based on the similarity, the physical similarity between a snake and the plant. Similarly, buckthorn could be used against dog bites and spinach against spider bites. In the early modern period, there was quite some innovation in botany. The number of known plants grew rapidly, and an important addition to botanical works were plant illustrations. In the Middle Ages, you still find very few images that accompany plant descriptions. On the left, you see a very rare example from a medieval manuscript of the famous work by Dioscorides, whom we already encountered on the frontispiece by Clusius. On the right, you see another example from a manuscript by Conrad von Negenberg that was intended to be used in the field, but as you can imagine, it's quite hard to distinguish plant species based on these kinds of images. From the 16th century onwards, you find images in almost every botanical work. In the 16th century, woodcuts are frequently used, as you can see in these two examples. Obviously, this is capsicum, Spanish pepper. On the left, you see an example from the herbal by Leonhard Fuchs, one of the famous German authors on botany of the 16th century. And on the right, you can see the exact same plant in the herbal by Flemish botanist Rembert Dodoens. As you can see in the image on the right, the engraving by Dodoens is copied from an example by Leonhard Fuchs, and you can tell because the image on the right is a negative image from Fuchs's example. So it was drawn after Fuchs, then cut in wood, and then printed in negative in Dodoens' herbal, and that's why you get these similar images. As you can imagine, these images were an important addition to botanical works because before the use of images became widespread, authors had to rely exclusively on written textual descriptions. Furthermore, exotic species could become much better known by including an image in botanical works. But now the big question is, what was the use of these plant descriptions in practice? One of the most important uses of plants in the early modern period was as ingredients for medicines, apart from many other uses. So many plants were not only used as medicine, but also as pigment, as dyes, as foodstuffs, as luxury items, and so on. But pharmacy was an important use for many medicinal plants. Here you see three exotic medicinal plants that were very important in the early modern period. On the left, you can see Peruvian bark, the bark from the cinchona tree that originally grew in Peru and was later transplanted to India and Indonesia by the British and the Dutch. And it was mainly used against malarial fevers. In the middle, you can see the ipecacuanha root from Brazil, which was known as a vomiting root and used against dysentery. And on the right, you can see Sarsaparilla root from Smilax species from the West Indies, the New World, that were used against venereal diseases like syphilis. Now in the year 2020, it's quite easy to get an understanding of these tropical plant species because even if you don't have live specimens nearby, you can get an understanding of them from images and botanical descriptions. But when you were an apothecary in 1720, 3 centuries ago, you did not have such images, live specimens, or proper descriptions. What you did have were dried samples that were shipped to Europe as dried goods, dried pieces of bark, dried pieces of root. And as you can understand, it is quite different to understand what good Peruvian bark or good Ipecacuanha root is if you do not know anything about the actual plant, but have to rely exclusively on dried samples. So in many botanical and pharmaceutical works, you find descriptions of samples of tropical plant species, like the one you see here. This is an image from a series of articles by Willem van Ranau, an 18th century physician in Amsterdam, who meticulously describes every variety of Peruvian bark you might encounter in the docks of Amsterdam. If you open up a chest of bark and would find various kinds, various varieties of Peruvian bark, what were the key characteristics you had to keep an eye out for as a pharmacist, as a physician? And in fact, early modern apothecaries were trained to recognize these kinds of dried botanical samples. What you see here on the left is a Simplicia chest, a large chest with drawers full of small boxes of dried samples of natural products. Not only botanical items, but also um, singular drugs from animal and mineral origin. And these kinds of chests were used by physicians to train and examine aspiring apothecaries, to teach them to recognize every kind of dried sample you might encounter and might have to use as an apothecary. And there were a great number of different exotic species that you had to learn as an early modern apothecary. What you see here is my mashup of exotic drug components that can be found of the Pharmacopoeia of Lille in northern France from 1779. A pharmacopoeia is a manual for apothecaries describing all the drug components that they had to have in stock and the main recipes for drugs that they were supposed to prepare on a regular basis. And as you will glimpse over all these names, you will encounter many of them that sound familiar, even though they are described here by their Latin names. So have a look at them and see how many you recognize. If you understand Dutch and you want to learn more about what early modern apothecaries actually knew and did and the framework they used to do their craft, this might be a great additional resource. This is a digital exhibition I helped to create for the National Pharmaceutical Museum, which shows you all kinds of drug components that apothecaries had to know. So, for instance, we have a slideshow with a lot of exotic drug components with high quality images from an apothecary chest in Boerhaven Museum in Leiden with descriptions what they were and what they were used for. Now, all this changes in the 19th century. Like I said at the beginning of this talk, around 1800 is a big turning point in world history and for the history of pharmacy as well. Because from the 1800s onwards, pharmacists start to extract the active substances from botanical samples. And this is a great step forward for pharmacy as a scientific discipline. In the 19th century, pharmacy really becomes a laboratory science, whereas prior to the 19th century, it was more of a craft you learned in practice from a practicing apothecary. But in the 19th century, it becomes much easier to do accurate tests and to create accurate dosages of samples for specific patients, for specific diseases. And as a result, these medicinal plants as a whole are no longer necessary. So you do not need opium bulbs anymore if you can extract morphine from them. You do not need Jesuit's bark from Peru anymore if you can extract quinine from it, and so on. So to finish, I want to show you some examples of Dutch bioprospecting. Now, as you probably know, the Dutch were very active in global commerce in the early modern period. The Dutch East India Company was the first multinational to ship all kinds of tropical goods to and from the East Indies. And many countries were active as big trading companies. Medicinal substances were also traded in large quantities, but you do not see them on this map simply because other products were far more important. And these are the big staple products you know from history textbooks: sugar, tea, and coffee, spices like nutmeg, cloves, and pepper, opium, textiles, silk. Medicinal substances were also shipped, but usually in much smaller quantities. Of course, getting exotic plants from tropical areas is a very difficult, expensive, and dangerous exercise. So, what many nations and many trading companies tried to do was to make the process easier. For instance, by getting these tropical plants to grow closer to home. And many efforts were made by botanical gardens to grow tropical plants themselves. On the left, you can see an image of the orangery of the illustrious School of Amsterdam, the predecessor of the University of Amsterdam. And most European universities, and I might say every Dutch university in the early modern period, had a very well-known and very good botanical garden with many tropical plant species. Other examples of trying to grow tropical plants closer to home was the Wardian case, a sort of small greenhouse that could be used aboard ship to take live samples of plants home with you. On the bottom right, you can see a serum, which is a way of packaging. It is a vicuña, a dried vicuña skin. Vicuña is an animal from South America, and these skins were used to keep dried exotic products good across long oceanic journeys. So there were many ways to keep both live and dried plant samples across the ocean to Europe. And there were quite some Dutch efforts to increase knowledge of exotic plants in the early modern period. One of the most well-known is Willem Piso, you see him on the right here, who published the Historia Naturalis Brasiliae in 1648. He accompanied the Dutch Count Johan Maurits van Nassau-Siegen, who was briefly the governor of the Dutch colony in Brazil in the 1640s. And during this small episode, Willem Piso acted as Johan Willem's personal physician, and he made many descriptions of tropical plant species from Brazil. In the middle here you see perhaps the most famous plant he describes, the Ipecacuanha root that we already encountered earlier. Another example is the Hortus Indicus malabaricus, still a very famous work about Indian botany that was produced by a whole team of botanists, both European and indigenous. And the whole project was led by Hendrik Adriaan van Rede tot Drakenstein, a Dutch official in the Dutch East India Company. In the middle, you see an example from this work which no longer used woodcuts but copper engravings, which show much more details. And as you can see on the top right of this image in the middle, you can see many different and also local names for these plants. So this was really a collaborative effort between European and local Indian knowledge of tropical plants. The third example I want to show you is the herbal by Georg Everard Rumphius about the flora of Ambon, the Ambonese archipelago in Indonesia, which also included many highly detailed images. And what these examples show is that the interest of Europeans in tropical botany was mainly directed at commercial gains. So early modern states and trading companies did not have a principal interest to increase botanical knowledge, but they would support any initiative that might find profitable exotic plants. And that is why usually only individuals who operated within these European trading companies were interested in exotic botany in the first place, and not so much in commercial gain. That only happened when the states or the trading companies realized the potential benefits that could be made from tropical medicine. So the take-home message from this lecture consists of 4 points, I think. In the first place, botany and ethnobotany, so studying tropical plants in the early modern period, was closely related to medicine and pharmacy. Most tropical plants that were discovered and described and used in the early modern period had first and often foremost a medicinal application. What you also see is that knowledge about exotic plants in early modern texts is often work in progress. Even in handbooks and manuals, you find a lot of knowledge that is not yet true handbook material. There's still a lot of fragmented knowledge. Authors rely on previous authors. They rely on hearsay, and descriptions change all the time. As a result, there are many ambiguities in botanical works on tropical botany in the early modern period, because many authors have not seen many of the plant species themselves. A third point to take home is that local knowledge is mostly absent. I just showed you the example of the Hortus indicus malabaricus. That is quite an exception. There is a lot of local knowledge in early modern botanical works, but it is hidden between the lines, you could say. Sometimes it is forgotten, sometimes it is deliberately left out, but very often it is transformed to make it look like it is actual European knowledge. You see this, for instance, in the case of Peruvian bark, which was known as a febrifuge remedy among local Peruvians in the 17th century, but when Europeans took it home with them, they created a story around it where the wife of the Peruvian viceroy was the first to encounter its therapeutic properties. And this story was used to make Peruvian bark acceptable for European audience of both physicians and patients. Now, the final point to take home is that early modern Europeans did bioprospecting. And this is slightly different from ethnobotany because it's not a scientific activity in the first place. There's often a personal interest in botany among many officials within trading companies. I showed you the examples of Willem Piso, Hendrik Adriaan van Rede tot Rakenstein, and Rumphius, but the companies and states as a whole are not principally interested in botany if there is no commercial benefit to be had from them. That is what I wanted to tell you today. I hope you enjoyed this talk, and if you have any questions, I will be willing to answer them.